summer, the nation celebrated the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, the Civil Rights March. And I was in high school living in Hawaii when that march happened. And so I was too young and too far away to be able to be there. But even though I was thousands of miles away, the civil rights movement had the power to move across the Pacific Ocean to reach me, to touch me, and to change my life as an individual, and really to change the lives of millions of other people. A few years later, when I was in college, I was also part of other social movements, the anti-war, the Asian American, and also the women's rights movement. And it all drew inspiration from the civil rights movement. Whoops, sorry. The 60s were an incredibly, incredibly exciting time. Across the country, people were inspired not only about how to make equality real across the country, we were also moved about what this meant for us in our own individual lives, what the culture shift was that was required for us to be part of these social movements. You know, it makes me smile to think way back then in my college days and how I tried to make this real for myself as an individual. And you have to remember that this was the 1960s. So for example, women on campus were still required to wear skirts to class. And so I had a pretty long distance to go as a budding feminist. I was going out with a guy who later became my husband. And what I loved about our relationship and what I loved about him was our willingness to reimagine our life together about how it would be more equal. So Brian learned how to cook and to bake bread, and I learned about tools and cars. And I remember one night when we were both living outside of Baltimore, I had to drive into town, and the road was very icy, and I realized that I had a flat tire. So I got out of the car, I put on my gloves, I opened the trunk, I got out the tools, and just like my husband taught me, I changed that damn tire. And it gave me an incredible sense of power. I was cold and I was dirty, but I felt powerful. So this is the power of social movements. They change our sense of what we can do as individuals and what we can do as communities. When I was asked what the title of my talk would be, I landed on Be the Change, as in be the change that you want to see in the world. I thought it was really spot on because if we aspire to the kind of transformational changes that social movements can make, then we also have to transform ourselves as grant makers. Traditional forms of philanthropy just won't cut it. So when funding social movements, we have to be different kind of grant makers. Really, we have to be more than grant makers. And so this, I believe, is the challenge and the promise of philanthropy. How can we as funders embody the kind of change that will allow us to be real change makers? As some of you may know, the Haas Jr. Fund has supported for over a decade both the gay and lesbian rights movement and the immigrant rights movements. And I want to share with you today a few of our experiences and then share some thoughts about what it might mean to be the change as a funder. Let me begin by introducing you to Evan Wolfson. I met Evan in 1999 when he was a civil rights lawyer. And the fund was interested in hiring him to head our new gay and lesbian program. During our discussion, Evan convinced us that the fund needed to make marriage equality the centerpiece of our gay and lesbian work because he argued that marriage was the gateway to literally hundreds of rights. And so we decided to take that risk, even though there were many people in the movement at that time who did not agree about the importance of marriage. So instead of hiring Evan, we decided to give him his first grant of $2.5 million to start an organization called Freedom to Marry. And we believed that this organization could become a unifying force to build a movement for marriage. With that grant, the Haas Jr. Fund became the first foundation to make same-sex marriage a priority. So now let's fast forward to 2013. I have to admit that I never, ever dreamed that we would see so much progress in such a relatively short period of time. In 2001, not a single state offered gays and lesbian couples the right to marry. And today, 14 states do, including the District of Columbia. And a solid majority of Americans support the right to marry the one that you love. This is evidence of the real power that social movements have to change hearts and minds. So what have we learned about the change-maker roles that philanthropy can play in social movements? What are the ways that we need to be the change? Here are 3 ideas I'd like to offer. First, be a connector. Social movements are made up of organically grown networks of groups and individuals, some of whom are in close connection with and close relationship to each other, but many others are not. So the challenge is getting movement groups to make a culture shift in how they work together, to give up turf, to build the kind of trust that's necessary to work out thorny differences, and so that they can create a common vision and a common strategy. This is what allows groups to connect the dots between the national, the state, and the local work, and it allows individual groups to find their own place, their own role within this larger movement ecology. This is what makes it possible for them to share work plans, to share leadership, and sometimes even to share major donors. This is what makes it possible to develop the collective power to make change. So let me give you an example. In 2004, the gay and lesbian movement suffered bruising losses when 11 states banned same-sex marriage. This was a very dark time in the movement, and we saw that if we continue to do what we've always been doing, we would continue to fail. We really seriously needed to up our game. So the fund worked with colleagues to bring together 22 movement leaders to sit down to craft a 20-year strategy for winning marriage equality, state by state. And this game plan continues to guide the movement today. Just as significant, having this game plan allows funders, small and large, national and local, to align our individual investments against a common strategy so that there's collective muscle behind an ambitious social change. Unfortunately, this is much easier said than done. Although we encourage grantees to work differently for a larger social cause, we funders don't make it easy. In fact, we can be part of the problem by having grantees jump through different hoops for different donors, by giving too little money and expecting too much, and by funding only narrow interests. We don't often walk the talk enough ourselves. And on top of this, we don't always play well together because of our need to own and to brand the work that we fund. The bottom line is, by helping to paint this big picture and by connecting the dots so both funders and activists can move in the same direction, this is what allows individual funders to punch above our weight in terms of big social issues. But to do that, we need to be the change by challenging ourselves to work differently, to remove barriers for grantees, to learn how to lead quietly, and to lead from behind. Second, be a deep investor. As funders, we need to understand the full range of capacities that movements need to win. Having a great game plan is not enough. Movements need the capacity to organize, to advocate, to do research, to develop messaging, to communicate well. But in addition to these basic capacities, we've learned about the power of investing in leaders to be more effective in their own individual organizations. So we give groups grants to play their part in the overall movement, and on top of that, through the fund's leadership program, we give support for leadership development. And the National Center for Lesbian Rights is a great example of the kind of impact that you can have when you do that. Meet Kate Kendall, Executive Director. In 2005, as the struggle for marriage equality really heated up in California and across the country, the organization was called upon to play a much bigger role in the movement, and it put this organization under tremendous stresses. But support to strengthen things like executive coaching, board leadership development, fund development, and strategic communications, these kinds of leadership investments enabled Kate and her team to build the bench strength in the organization, which then allowed Kate to play a much stronger national leadership role in the movement. I want to add a couple of other things about being a deep investor. You know, those of us in philanthropy are pretty good at giving away money. That's our job. But I would argue that we need to rewrite our job descriptions to include another role, and that's the role of fundraiser. We can't just be checkbook philanthropists. That's the easy part. The hard part is using all of our assets, not just the money. So relationships to people of wealth, to other foundations, to civic and public leaders, as well as the ability to open doors so that there's more money that's coming to the table, more allies who can do the work. These are the kinds of things that we need to be using in terms of our assets. Second, deep investing is about sticking with the work through its inevitable setbacks and failures, and there will be many. We can't be the change if we think about our work in only 3 or 5 year segments. Transformative change takes patient philanthropy. Finally, be a risk taker. It wasn't a slam dunk for our trustees to decide to support gay rights. Getting to yes called for staff to listen very closely to what our trustees deeply cared about, as well as what they were deeply concerned about. It required us to talk very candidly about what all the risks were, even as we were trying to paint the picture of what this really meant for families in our backyard. I want to end with a story of Evie Haas, who founded the Haas Jr. Fund 60 years ago with her husband, Walter. In 1999, Evie was in her 70s, and I remember talking to her and the other trustees about marriage equality and about gay rights. And during that discussion, Evie declared that she thought that everyone should have these rights. One of her children leaned over to her and said that, you know, some of her friends would probably not agree with and would not like this very controversial work. And what she said, which I loved, was very simple. They'll just have to get over it. The fund has seen how philanthropy can have a big impact, especially when we work at the frontiers of social change and when we stay the long haul. But to get there, we also need to be the change. We need to be the kind of connectors, the kind of investors, and the kind of risk takers that social movements need to make the world a better place for us all. Let's be that change. Thank you.